Okay, hello everyone. Are we good to go, Alex? I think I am.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. We'll go ahead and get started. I guess let's see how many we've gotten here that are joining. So let me just get a minute before we get started and make sure that everyone's joining. So people are kind of piling in right now, and those that piled in on time and early, thank you for joining. And people are loading up right now. So let me just give it a minute here, and then I'll do an introduction to the panelists. And we'll get started. So give it another 30 seconds, and then I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I know everyone's on we're sensitive time frame in our industry, right? We're always got the next thing to do. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So this is a two-part series. First of all, thank you all for joining. My name is Ken. I'm with the Washington Hospitality Association, and we're on a part two series of intelligent exit strategy, selling your hospitality business in 2022 and beyond. So we've got a lot of people are looking at different strategies today for what we've gone through. We had, so being a two-part series, we had part one, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, where we reviewed how you can increase the value of your business and how to decide if your business needs a business broker. Alex, my friend here, who's on the dark screen there, you don't see her, but she will put the link to watch the replay into the chat. And also for everyone that registered and or is attending this one, we'll also send that replay out as well as this one. So in case you didn't get a chance to see part one, you have the opportunity to do that. In part two here, we're going to cover every step you need to close the sale from marketing to a smooth and successful transition of ownership. So our guest here today is first, let me introduce Oliver Kotelnikov. Did I say it right, Oliver?
He did.
All right. That's twice.
Thank you, Ken. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Oliver's the lead broker for business in the hospitality sector at IBA. And IBA is a Pacific Northwest premier full-service business brokerage. I think it's nice as we deal in the Northwest to really having someone here that focuses on the Northwest. Great business partner here with the Washington Hospitality Association and its members. They have offices in Bellevue, Spokane, Portland. IBA has represented owners of the regional hospitality businesses in sale of their companies since 1975, with over 4,200 successful completed transactions. Oliver himself comes from our industry. I don't know about all you guys, but sometimes I feel the same way. It's nice to have someone that understands what I'm going through and that's, been an operator in the business. He's got 25 years in the trenches and on the front lines of the restaurant industry as an owner operator of Piroshki Bakery, yep. A growing family business that they had with 5 locations and over 60 employees. So I think the great thing that I've learned about Oliver over the years is that, he understands our business. And like I said, it's just nice to have someone that understands what you're going through. So thank you, Oliver, for being here, and thank you for being a friend to the association and to the members and helping them out as they're buying and selling their businesses. So we appreciate
absolutely happy to be a resource.
And then with Oliver today, he has a special guest, Wade Stringfield. Wade, hello, Wade.
Hey, Wade.
Hello, Wade. How you guys doing?
Wade is in the banking industry, a veteran, having spent nearly 17 years working in the Puget Sound area. He recently serves as an SBA sales manager for SaviBank. For SaviBank. Their bank is just a little bit more sharper than everybody else's. I'm just teasing Wade here. He holds a BBA from Oklahoma Baptist University and an MBA from the University of Oklahoma, and is a graduate from the Pacific Coast Banking School. So we're excited to have Wade here, and thank you, Wade, for being with us.
My pleasure. Happy to join.
All right, so today let's get to it. So successful transition of ownership. The topics we're going to kind of touch on today is going to be marketing, negotiation, financing, and completing the sale. I think sometimes we want to sell our business, right? We think that's easy, and we're just going to tell everybody we got it for sale, and then we deal with all kinds of challenges that we find out, like maybe we don't want our employees to know until we actually have made some firm decisions. But at the end of the day, there's a process, and business bankers really help us go through the process and keep us, on task as operators to make sure that if we're going to do this, we're going to maximize our opportunities, as well as make sure that we transition the business to the right ownership. At least that's the perspective that I've had with buying and selling businesses over the years as a multi-unit operator in many states. So with that, I'm going to open it up with you, Oliver, and want to talk about marketing. So can you address a little bit about the subject of marketing when it comes to selling your business?
Absolutely, yeah. And so transitioning from part one, we've evaluated the business, we've decided to go to market. What does going to market entail? And so the goal of marketing, first of all, confidentiality. What makes it different from other transactions is that we need to expose the business and the opportunity to what we consider to be the target demographic of quality buyers without necessarily letting the world know that the business is for sale. We have customers, we have vendor relationships, we have employees, and that news needs to be delivered strategically at the transactionally appropriate time. So marketing the business confidentially, we use several avenues. We use commercial platforms. We use our professional network. We use IBA specifically has a proprietary database of buyers and sellers who, based on 40 years of experience, have bought and sold businesses with IBA and are considered to be highly qualified buyers. Knowing what those parties are looking for, it allows us to make a good match between the parties and generate really a competitive marketplace for our clients. And our job is to deliver offers, qualified offers. And part of that process, what do we mean by qualified? Well, part of what I do as a broker is make sure that the buyer is a good fit. One, that they're a good fit to operate the business. That they can complete the transaction financially, and that they're a good fit to work with in transition. And ultimately, most sellers, it's their life's work. They want to see it succeed, that they're a good fit to continue the legacy.
Agreed. And not that there's any one area that's more important to the other, but I think, at the end of the day, right, if we don't market the business correctly, we don't find the right buyer, the rest of this just becomes difficult at best. So it's really matching that up. Wade, did you have anything you wanted to add in the marketing aspect? I know you kind of focus on some other areas here, but I don't want to pass you up from anything you might be wanting to toss in.
No, nothing to add, just to echo Oliver's sentiments about, for most business owners, it's their life's work. So I certainly can understand that, and that's most of the time how they approach it when they get me involved.
Finding the right buyer is key, right? I mean, it's really important. All right, so with that, obviously, we want to find the right buyer. We have some people kicking the tires, right? Hopefully a couple of those are some really good, people that we'd like to buy the business, right? So let's start talking about negotiation, because to me, this is kind of the favorite part of it, right? you want to get the value, and sometimes there's some separation, right, to what we want and what we want for the value and what someone wants to pay for it. So with that, Oliver, I'm going to go to you first again on this.
Sure. And again, we're going back to part one on evaluation, which is really the foundation. And so when fair market opinion of value, there is a range, but but it's a tight range, and once we agree on that, we expect to deliver a buyer around that price range with some minimal variance. So, price point important, and we're negotiating on that, but we're fairly confident we can come into port on what's been promised there. Other points that we're negotiating: timeline, and then this is where lending would come in. For instance, there are buyers with liquid funds, and that perhaps shortens the process. But when is it going to close? Are they able to close? When are they able to close? Transition training. There's typically a transition training period that requires an effort on the seller's behalf after the transaction is closed. So it becomes a negotiation point, and an important token. Relationships need to be transitioned. Employees, customers, vendors. There needs to be, the landlord relationship needs to transition. So how long is all that taking, and how is that going to look? Typically it's guided by time period, let's say a month, 2 months, and the amount of hours that's allocated. Non-compete clauses, the buyer typically wants to make sure that the new owner is indeed moving on, whether they're retiring or diversifying their investments, but that they're not going to damage that goodwill that the buyer just paid for. So that portion needs to be negotiated. The owner may want to go into a field of similar field as an employee. They may not be retiring, so a non-compete agreement needs to be intelligently structured. And I mean, those are some of the key points in negotiation. But timeline and closing, and I think Wade can add here, is a big part. If SBA, if an outside lender is involved, which they typically are.
Right, and
Definitely.
And you help work with someone who's buying to set that up as well. So if someone's looking for resources to fund their purchase, you bring people like Wade in, right?
So absolutely, yeah. I would get an idea of what the source of funding is at the negotiation stage. We want to make sure that the buyer is capable of completing the transaction, and then we would get into timelines and deal structure after that.
Additional thoughts, Wade?
Absolutely. So just some real basic detail here. So if you're dealing with a commercial banker to finance an acquisition of a business, I think 10 times out of 10, unless it's a corporate level sort of merger, if it's a small business sort of deal, that commercial lender is going to be using an SBA loan product, and typically it's the SBA 7A loan product. So the three things that Oliver mentioned that are very much of importance when you're going through this SBA 7A loan process is, like you mentioned, the timeline, knowing when financing contingencies are up or going to expire, getting an idea of what the training is going to be like for the departing owner, what are they going to offer, how much are they going to be available. The SBA has a limit on that. Oddly enough, it can be a 12-month arrangement. So that's something to keep in mind. Owner can't stay on indefinitely to provide services and get paid for them essentially once the transaction has been completed, but they can sign on to be an independent contractor or a consultant for up to 12 months. So that's going to be important. We're also going to ask that there be some sort of non-compete structured in there. Depending on the nature of business, it could be for a specific length of years or years plus a geographic radius, something like that. And then the lease is important as well. Whether it's a lease that's going to be assumed by the buyer, we've got some limitations on how long or how short we can accept a lease to coincide with our loan term. So. Definitely, having a guy like Oliver in your corner to kind of sort those details out is going to be key.
And Wade, I mean, I just went through a transaction where an SBA lender was involved, and a typical term is 10 years, correct, on the 7A product?
Correct.
Yeah.
It's the maximum term.
So a lender would typically require the lease assignment, regardless of what the current term is, to be a standard 5 years plus 5-year option, because they want to see the new owner have the rights to occupancy for at least that long to protect their investment. So they would actually indirectly, the lender and the landlord would be working together through a broker to make sure that both parties are satisfied in that regard. But a lease can be time consuming, and it's an important piece that needs to be out there and in full sunlight.
So I would assume some owners, right, they have great relationships with their landlords and they have those conversations up front, right, and start to address that. Some might not. Some might be a little bit more inexperienced, or at the end of the day, maybe don't have a great relationship with their owner or their landlord. Is that something that, Oliver, you guys step in and support and help if needed? Where does it kind of stand in that aspect of you guys lending support?
Yeah, and good question. And it starts again, we're going back to the pre-qualifying of buyers, because just like I'm going to need to present the buyer to the lender, a similar process will need to happen with the landlord, because the landlord has a vested interest in a successful business. They're in the business of receiving rent. If the business isn't succeeding, obviously that's not happening. So we need to bring in relevant experience, and we can touch on that, ties into that. But the landlord's going to have many of the same questions that the lender will have, and will need reassurances that this buyer will succeed. So 1, relevant experience; 2, transition training. So
that's kind of part of your initial, getting to know the buyer or getting to know the seller, is what's all needed, into making sure that you can get through that process successfully and not picking those pieces up down the road. It's kind of like, what's that package look like, and what do we need to start working on before we go to market, right?
We look at that early on. And you touched on that, which is an important piece, is what's the relationship like. Sometimes, it's a smaller landlord who owns one building, lives in the building, and the tenant's been there for 25 years. Am I going to say, hey, I'm going to reach out to your landlord and let them know you're selling? In that case, probably not. I'm going to say, you guys have a relationship. If you want my help, go ahead. But have a face-to-face meeting and because you have a personal rapport. If it's a larger, maybe a corporate landlord that I've experience with communicating with, then I will make the introduce the topic and make the introductions with buyers and facilitate a meeting and sit in on those meetings. Yes, absolutely, to make sure that the lease transfers.
All right, let me do a little administrative duty here. If ask questions, you can ask as you go along here. Just type them into the Q&A.
Please.
We have the chat. We're keeping both here. So just so you know, if you have questions as we go along, I'll make sure we get to them and fit them in. And then obviously there's going to be, or not obviously, but there will be, we'll shoot an email out, I think within 48 hours after we do this, 24 to 48 hours, with the link. There's an opportunity to ask additional questions, and we'll make sure that Oliver and Wade's information's on there. So we got some more here to go through, but just wanted to make sure that you guys were aware that you don't have to sit down here and jot a bunch of notes. You can come back and look at this later, or we'll make sure you have Oliver and Wade's contact information for follow-up. All right, so with that, under negotiations, I don't have anything else. I think that's more of, again, pre-strategy. We're going to know what our price terms, what we're looking for as operators before we're going to market. All that's kind of communicated and organized. And so what that package is. Does it include building? Does it include property? Does it not include property? Et cetera, equipment. What are the options? And I think owners should definitely recognize there might be options. You might have someone that's looking for the business, but you might have someone that's just looking for that space. And
I just saw a question from the chat. Is it okay to address it? I mean,
yeah.
On that topic.
Let me read it out first so everybody knows what the question is. It's what about those who own their building? Is the sale a separate transaction?
So good question. And IBA is licensed to represent both sellers of real estate and the businesses together. And I've done multiple transactions, and typically presenting the assets as a package is most attractive to the marketplace. You know, from the lending standpoint, there's real estate, it collateralizes the transaction and gives everybody security, but we'll look at the real estate and the business separately. We'll evaluate them separately and present that evaluation, and then we'll present the evaluation as a package. So you will see options, but I can tell you that IBA is one of the few brokerages in the state that everybody holds a commercial real estate license and is able to transition both assets for the client. So happy to look at that for any seller-owned real estate with the business in it.
And then those, I would say, Wade, if someone is in a scenario, I mean, obviously real estate is very helpful. It's a great thing that the SBA likes to see. But if you're dealing with someone who might not be able to afford the real estate, I'm sure there's a lot of leaseback opportunities and things like that where people love real estate. I mean, when it comes to the transaction, right, at the end of the day, if you can afford the business and not the real estate, generally, for the most part, as long as the real estate is being sold at, you know, at fair market value, right, a reasonable market value, that there's going to be a way for them to partner up and fund, correct?
Yeah. I mean, you know, we can finance acquisitions with or without real estate. If it's a seller that owns both, right, the business and the real estate, we typically find that lease negotiations go fairly well if they're motivated to sell, right? Because if they want to keep the real estate, but they just want to sell the business, they'll pretty much bend over backwards to get the go forward lease to look like something that's acceptable on a lender's basis. But definitely, to Oliver's point, if the cash flow works and buyer wants to buy the real estate, seller wants to sell the real estate, we certainly will finance the entire package as well.
Sure. Okay, we have a question up. Hi, John. Good to see you're on here. What if our current lease is less than 5 years without any additional extensions? Landlord wasn't willing to extend it or extend it when we signed it a couple of years ago because they want to control the property in case of development. We have been in our lease space since 2004 and don't see any major moves to develop our street. So I would think one is for sure, right, retouch on that landlord, because 2 years ago, a couple years ago versus today, everything's changed. But Oliver, how do you address someone who's really in a scenario where they've really only got, 2, 3, 4 years on a lease and the landlord is not wanting to negotiate?
So I'm going to guess that this property is probably in King County, and it's typical of owners in King County to either, give it the short leash or put what's called a demo clause in the lease, where they're saying, within an X amount, let's say, and I've had this recently, 12 months notice, they can cancel the lease. And that is there for them, in case they get a big offer, they get to sell the building. Now, the number of times that actually occurs is it's minimal. So you have to consider building permits. It takes right now in Seattle to build anything. If someone was to buy the building and redevelop it, it's probably 2 to 3 years. So landlords hedge against it. It's not a plus for the buyer. It's certainly going to be a point of contention for the lender to see that in there. But if we can make a case to the landlord that there's recurring revenue here, and again, remind them that commercial landlords are in the business of receiving rent, and we're providing a roadmap for 10 years for that to occur, it's part of negotiations. So,
so it's possible.
I got one thing to add.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the upshot on the loan side is if you've got a landlord that says, hey, I'm not willing to extend, or what you have is what you have, well, then we have to limit the loan term to the remaining term of that lease. So if you're going from a 10-year loan term potential to maybe in this case 4 years or 3 years, that basically is going to torpedo cash flow, in my opinion, in terms of shrinking the amortization schedule on that loan down to 3 years. Probably
because the monthly payments are going to be
well.
exorbitant, right?
Right. So then honestly, we've had a scenario like this where in the case that we were just dealing with, fortunately, this was essentially going to be a second location. I had a buyer that operated a business in a particular industry, acquired another business in that same industry. It was going to be operated in a different geographical location. Ran into the very same thing that Oliver just mentioned in terms of the landlord wanting control of that building for redevelopment. So basically, he's like, well, I'm just gonna carve all those assets out of that space and move them somewhere else and get a lease that will fit the 10-year loan term.
So also, I mean, a lot of this is fear-based, right? Or a landlord looking at the value today and it's going to change tomorrow because the market's going to be different 4 years from now, right? I mean, at the end of the day, or if the landlord's got a bigger plan, I'm going to knock this down and I'm going to put I might put an apartment building or whatever, right? Something different. That's a different scenario. But I would think, Oliver, that this is where you guys can come in and maybe work with a landlord and come up with a potential range of something or some terminology that would help support a seller coming in, right? And maybe satisfy a landlord that there's a fair market value happening here or opportunity.
Correct. And fair market value is the key term, because what the landlord doesn't want, and keep them, and this is increasing because we're, by all indications, in an inflationary time, the landlord doesn't want to get locked into a lease and have an underperforming asset on their hands. Let's say they sign a 5-year lease, 60 months, and in 2 years, within 24 months, the rents jump by 20%, which they can do. All of a sudden, now if they go to sell, it's not an attractive piece of commercial property because it's underperforming and it's locked into a contract. So what typically solves that is some sort of a market rent adjustment clause, right? So normally it would be consumer price index, CPI, which has been at 3% for years. So everybody would have a 3% annual increase. It will probably not cut it anymore. So if the landlord is afraid of, if the reason for not signing the lease, which can be a legitimate concern, is not wanting to be locked into a below market rent, so the solution is to put in place a mechanism that addresses that concern and has the business paying market rent, which could be, it could be based on comparative market analysis. It could be based on consumer price index, what it actually is at the end of the year reconciled, which is going to be larger than 3. Like right now, today, they reported inflation is running at close to 7% already. So if you're increasing rents at 3% as a landlord, you can see that's just straight bad business. So addressing that though, market rent is a strong concept, and so putting a mechanism in place to address that can have put a roadmap in place to a long-term lease.
Okay, I don't want to get stuck here, but because I want to move on here on the topics. But Wade, I do have a final question in this particular area. So obviously you need something from a landlord, right, in a scenario like this, that's going to know that there's some type of transaction, or at least a range, I would think, that you're going to support. Because if not, you're going to write that business you've got to have that loan written off in 4 years versus 7 or 10 years, which is what the buyer needs. Because if not, this really limits the seller to be able to sell the business, because at the end of the day, the business is only there for 4 years and can drop their value tremendously, right? So this aspect of what's going on here and the dynamics of someone controlling that lease and not allowing an option, right? I think making sure that there's an option, but there's a range in there that you can deal with. You want to make any comments on this before we move on to the next topic?
The only thing, I agree with you in terms of having options. The only thing I would consider, it's really a tough spot, because if you're a buyer, and I typically work for the buyer, right? So if you're a buyer and you like this business and you've got a seller that wants to sell it to you, but the landlord just won't play ball, it's a tough spot to be in. So as a seller, if they have resources to improve or to have those good relationships with the landlord, I mean, it really does make things a lot simpler in terms of closing a loan. So, but yeah, ultimately we want the lease option or the lease expense to work with the ongoing future of that business. So that's what we're shooting for anyway.
You know, this is a great example, and I'm not trying to put a plug in here for you, Oliver, but it's a great example when a business broker is needed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you can bring in the buyer, you can bring in the seller. I mean, you have that options with, as long as the seller will, you know, you got the freedom to talk to the landlord. You know, you bring in that buyer and give that stubborn landlord maybe an opportunity to loosen up based on who that buyer and the qualifications of that buyer coming in is.
And then just have a roundtable discussion on what the remaining issues are. You know, let's talk about it. What are they?
Right. All right. Thank you guys for that. And then now next topic is financing. Wade, obviously, I love this that you represent. You got a buyer representation here and a seller and a buyer over here, right? So Wade, this is kind of you know, your area of expertise. What's the timing look like today? You know, you've gotten, I would assume SBA always takes forever to do everything. You got COVID. I don't know. What's timing look like? What's the relevant experience of the buyer? What do those type of things look like?
Sure thing. Yeah. So, I mean, it's probably fair to say if you're looking to purchase a business, you're dealing with a 90-day to 120-day timeline just out the gate, and that's once you have a completed application package. So any preamble, getting the documents together, you know, don't even start the clock. So that's first and foremost. You know, prior to COVID, it was probably, you know, most lenders would shoot for between 45 and 90 days. With the advent of COVID, SBA has had to shift and change, and so there's some things that you need to uncover through the standard process now that may relate to what happened during COVID. So, you know, extended those timelines, not to mention the third-party valuation reports, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd say just, you know, bank on 90 to 120 days, and don't get me wrong, there's some lenders out there that probably will quote a faster turn time, and they may be able to do it for you. So, but I always like to aim high. That way I'm not too disappointed. But yeah, relevant experience of the buyer. I mean, that's something that's very important to SBA lenders or lenders across the board. When you're dealing with the SBA loan program, you know, the whole gist of the situation is that the SBA provides a guarantee to the lender to entice them to do some riskier lending necessarily. And if you look on the spectrum of commercial loans, anytime you have a change of ownership, it's just on the riskier side, regardless of what the underlying business is or how it performs. It's just a riskier loan when you're switching up ownership, or riskier scenario. So part of the onus that falls on the lender is demonstrating that we've analyzed the applicant supporting cash flows, and we believe this person's going to be successful, right? The buyer that we are financing is going to be successful at maintaining or furthering the subject business. And usually, if you're a banker, you're drawing on a lot of past performance to predict future behavior, right? And nothing kind of tells you how somebody can or will operate something if they have that relevant experience. So we're looking for, you know, 3 to 5 years of direct industry experience in either owning or managing a business, and that's really the threshold. As you guys are probably well aware, there's a lot of scrutiny on hospitality businesses because they have a higher failure rate than, say, non-hospitality businesses, all things else considered, I guess. But so we even key in more on that relevant experience when we're looking at a change of ownership with a hospitality business. But that's probably not a shock to you, but in terms of the threshold, maybe that's new information. So 3 to 5 years direct industry experience in either owning or managing a similar company.
Okay, and then forgiveness of federal assistance loans is, I mean, how much does this play a part now?
You know, they're so with the payment or paycheck protection program, the PPP loans, that's a non-negotiable. So in order to get standard money out the door, they're going to want to see that your PPP loan's been forgiven. The flip side, if it hasn't been forgiven or you still have time to get your application in, we've got to include that debt, those debt payments in your debt service calculation otherwise. So you might be right as rain, you might be headed straight for forgiveness without any issues, but until it's forgiven, we have to assume it won't be forgiven, and then we include it in your overall debt service.
And Wade, talk about the need to escrow the funds, the entire amount, which can be a sticking point for the seller. So let's say there's 60,000
right
unforgiven funds. What happens?
Right. So in a change of ownership scenario, the seller's going to have to escrow the full amount of the PPP loan at the PPP lender's institution. So not at escrow, but at the PPP lender's bank. So you'll find, and I've run into this literally, where some banks won't do it. I won't name names, but they're like, if the PPP loan is, you know, $40,000, they don't have any solution for you in terms of an escrow account. They're just going to say, well, you need to get it forgiven, and oh, by the way, we're not taking those applications until, you know, 4 months from now. So
and it cannot come out of the proceeds of the closing, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
So
you
that's
cannot,
the caveat.
Yep.
Okay. All right. I don't see any questions on this part, so I'm gonna go ahead and let's move on to closing and exiting, preparing the business for this transition. So Oliver, you want to take it from here? Sure.
Yeah, and closing and exiting, and then so this is a part where the dynamic switches, and this is where we've come to agreement. We've secured the lease, we've secured funding, and the buyer and seller begin to work collaboratively. They're transitioning accounts. They're perhaps at this point either having or having meetings with owners and vendors, or have already made the strategic disclosure. They're sometimes starting transition training, but it's basically preparing for that closing that may be at this point, 2 weeks to a month away, but they're working together. Parallel to that, escrow and closing procedures. So escrow is really kind of the glue and the link that holds everything together. So the escrow closers need to have the purchase and sale agreement. They need to have the executed lease. They need to have the closing paperwork signed by buyers and sellers. And so we're basically preparing for final transition of ownership and setting a date when the day will come when one party will physically have the keys in their hands and hand it to the other party and say, tomorrow, when you get here, it's your business. And so at that point, when the doors open and somebody rings a credit card through, that money needs to go to the right account, right? It can't go to the seller's account anymore. So we needed to have done the work in transition to set up that particular thing. When they turn on the lights, the utility bill is now going to, the new owner. So that's transition is just working out many little details. But like I said, the good news is there's generally a kind of a collaborative feeling to this process, and parties are working together. They're frequently in direct communication at this point, just ironing out the kinks and planning a grand opening or a soft opening or some kind of a retirement party for the seller. All those kinds of closing elements happen in closing and exiting.
I think sometimes, look, we built this business from small businesses, right? It's from the ground up. And when it comes time to think about selling, that transition of making it a good transition for both the seller, right? You're selling and you're wanting to find the right buyer. You want to deal with your employees correctly and make sure that they've got a good future and so on. And there's a lot more to this than just the thought of I'm selling my business. And I think of things like, PPP loans and, landlord negotiation and all those things that really and a buyer funding properly and being able to make sure that, the buyer is the right buyer and not just someone who would love to buy my business, but they can't afford it. Right.
And
The transition is really, really important. So I guess, sometimes the value we get out what we put in the value. And I guess the most important part that I think of having this webinar and going through this for those that are on it is we're going to get out of something what we put into it. And choosing the right business broker and someone who really understands our industry, someone who can help us from the planning stage of this to getting through and doing this within a timely basis, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. It could be a year from now, right? Whatever that transition is, it's really understanding that we go through the right steps to make sure the transition is good for us as an owner, for the employees, and for the person taking over the business, because we'll be driving by that business and it might still have our name that we chose on it, right? So you never know. So it's an important endeavor, an important responsibility to being an owner is if you transition is to having a smooth transition. So with that, I'm going to leave it a second for just any other questions, and just remind everybody that we will, like I said, follow up with, you can re-review this later. Make sure you have, we'll make sure you get Oliver and Wade's information. If there's anything that we didn't ask, just shoot back an email, when we send this out, and either myself or Oliver or Wade, depend on, what the questions are. We'll get back to you and make sure that you get the answers. And thank you all for attending. Oliver, thank you very much for.
Appreciate it. Ken, Washington Hospitality Association. Wade, viewers, thank you.
I'll tell you, Oliver, having someone like you in our team, today, and with the association, supporting our members and those that are having to take this consideration, buying and expanding some of them, and some of them, wanting to success, out of the industry and do something different, has been invaluable. So thank you very much. Wade, it's been great to get to know you here as well. We really need, the relationships going on between you and the business brokers, making sure that we've got someone that understands our business and can help the buyers that are coming in get the proper support and timing of this stuff. So thank you guys all very much. And I want to appreciate and thank all the members for attending. Oh, there's one question here. Let me make sure there's nothing going on. Is there an IBA representative in Spokane? Would you be taking that, Oliver, or do you pass that on?
Yeah, and there is an office in Spokane, but if this is a hospitality question, Wade, go ahead and give me a call. Happy to route it as necessary and just have an introductory call and then see where we are.
Okay. All right. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Have a good day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.